We set up this organisation in February of last year in anticipation that the Conservatives were unlikely to be re-elected in a general election and would have a time of reflection and rebuild once we were in opposition. The general election result was not what I wished, but it was roughly what I expected. And with the help of this brilliant man on my left, I set up PopCon, Popular Conservatism, really based on a question rather than an answer. And the question was as follows. Why was it that after 14 consecutive years of Conservative government in the United Kingdom, the United Kingdom was not more conservative in any aspect whatsoever than the country that we found ourselves coming into government in 2010? That if a Martian had come down to Britain in 2010 and taken a snapshot of it and a whole load of data analysis, and then had returned in July 2024 and said, based on this, who would you assume has been in government in the United Kingdom for the last 14 years? I think he probably would have said, well, a pretty woke left-wing socialist party has clearly been in power from 2010 to 2024. So this is quite a conundrum, isn't it? Why with the Conservative Party, 5 successive prime ministers, there's never been more than 5 consecutive Conservative prime ministers, a string of election victories, the best part of a decade and a half in power, and at the end of it, the country looks less conservative. Much less conservative. Virtually, pick your metric. Taxes as a proportion of national income are higher, state spending higher, individual freedom lower, regulation and red tape much, much higher. Why might this be so? And I appreciate then kind of retail media politics. People will say, well, it's down to the errors or frailties of different Conservative leaders. It's all down to Boris's cake and Liz's lettuce and Rishi's lack of an umbrella. And if only we'd had a bit more sort of strength and power and unity, everything would have come good. No doubt there are both strengths and weaknesses of all 5 of the Conservative Prime Ministers we had, but I suspected that the problem was rather deeper than that. And in discussions I've had with this gentleman over here, I think we've solved the problem, or at least got an analysis of what went wrong, such that if the Conservative Party finds itself fortunate enough to be in power again, and the message we're spreading is listened to, there is no chance that we would ever go again through 14 years of Conservative government and find at the end of it that the United Kingdom was more socialist, which is what we discovered in a decade and a half last time. And I think that comes down to, which we'll explore in depth in a minute, the real problem is the institutional, constitutional, governmental setup of the UK. That Conservatives, even if they win an election, are engaged in an exercise in pushing water uphill to get anything done at all. All of the rules of the game tilt towards more public spending, higher taxes, more and more regulations, more and more interventions in the lives of individual men and women. So it's a little bit like, I don't want to in any way diminish the horrors of the Warsaw Pact countries, but it's a little bit like trying to win as a centre-right free market party in East Germany. You might argue that Brezhnev was better than Stalin in the Soviet Union, but or that Gorbachev was better than Brezhnev. But if the institutional structures are in that direction, it doesn't much matter who wins the election. You can score a few minor, narrow victories for sure. I'm not suggesting that nothing was achieved in any area in the 14 years of Conservative government, some things were achieved. But my God, it was heavy going. The election victories were nowhere near enough to get stuff done. So conservatism and the Conservative Party need to be wholly rebuilt, and we need to work out what went wrong. And if you're interested in exploring that and you're not on our mailing list, please have a look at our leaflet. You can just go to our website, sign up. We don't require you to take any Boy Scout or Girl Guide pledge. If you're interested in exploring it, we'll just keep you abreast of the events we're holding, some bricks and mortar ones like this, generously hosted by friends in the Conservative movement, good number of online events that you can join from anywhere. So please do consider joining, and we'll send you a weekly bulletin. So there's the advert. The gentleman to my immediate left is, I think, the most important Conservative public intellectual in the United Kingdom today, who has spent a huge amount of his time not just analysing and agonising about the problem I just said I set out, but actually solving it with considerable intellectual and academic rigour. And he's persuaded me that his analysis and his solutions are correct. So, David, thank you for all you've done for the movement. Thank you for touring around the United Kingdom with me. Where to begin? And I wonder whether we might start, before going into the wider Starkey constitutional analysis, with some stuff that's happened in the last few days. What does it tell us about the way our country is run? So let me start with the present travails of the Deputy Prime Minister.
Must we?
I'm afraid we must. Because I think the interesting thing here, and I think this will tie into your wider analysis, is, it's unlikely that she has many friends or admirers in this room. But it seems that her fate is going to be determined, not politically by the Prime Minister, probably not by a criminal prosecution by the taxman or the Metropolitan Police, but by whether this guy called Sir Laurie Magnus, who I understand is the independent ethical advisor to the Prime Minister, determines whether she acted in a reasonable or an unreasonable fashion. Who is this guy, and why does he have so much power?
Oh, gosh, where to begin? Is this working? Yes. Good, right. What we've found ourselves in is in this extraordinary world in which once upon a time we expected our politicians to operate according to quite simple rules of being, in those days, they were gentlemen, then they become ladies, that you operate according to principles of honour and truth-telling. And then we decide, because they are no longer ladies and gentlemen, and dare I say it, if we're looking at Angela Rayner, it is a rather vigorous case of somebody who is neither a lady nor, even with these flexible definitions which are hanging around at the moment, a gentleman. We decided we had to have rules. And in order to have rules, we had to have somebody to enforce them. And rather than a straightforward moral code, the centrepiece of which you will remember, I'm old enough to remember Perfumer and whatever, was that simple test. Have you told the truth in the House of Commons or haven't you? And instead, we created an entire bureaucracy. A bureaucracy which is there to enforce a notional code of morality. So what we do, we replace that simple judgment, which we all have. Have we been honest? Have we been truthful? Have we put our private concerns above public ones? Instead, you replace it with a set of rules. So it becomes not, have you lied, but have you obeyed the rules? And the best illustration isn't actually Angela Rayner, it's that extraordinary performance that we had from the man who embodies this notion that everything is to be decided by rules, and that is Keir Starmer. You will remember he spent the whole of his time in opposition denouncing us and our politicians as monstrous, as corrupt, as ineffectual, as putting private interest in front of public interest. And the first thing that he does on being appointed is to have his clothes and his wife's clothes bought by Lord Ali. And then to refuse to apologise because he'd obeyed the rules, which he sought to have had. And then do you remember the most extraordinary thing was when people pointed out that he hadn't quite obeyed the rules. He did, and presumably, as he's not terribly numerate, which is rather a characteristic of this government, you know, there was much waving around of the calculation feature on iPhones, and he came up with the conclusion, and you may remember the figures better than I do, he'd received about £23,000 worth of clothes, his wife had received about 12, and he then made a calculation as to how much of this fell within the rules and how much didn't. And he thought he cleared himself in the eyes of the British public by paying back £6,522, 13 shillings and 4pence.
Based on some sort of capital gains tax judgment.
The sheer derangement of this mentality. But ladies and gentlemen, we are basically now governed on that principle. And the thing that's terrifying, and both of us in different ways, because he was supposed to be a peer, they were proposing to strip me of this ludicrous little bit of trinketry that hang round one neck, the CBE, because we'd both in one respect or another broken the rules. There is an entire team of exceedingly well-paid civil servants in Downing Street that were set up by no less a person than Sue Gray, which acts as effectively a combination of Stasi and Board of Censorship. It is mad. But everywhere you look, and what we're going to do now is to shift to look at the bigger picture, there's been this replacement of the straightforward rules of behaviour with rule upon rule, with subsections 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C, Roman number 1, Roman number 2, no, Roman number 3, lowercase b, lowercase c. It is a world of madness. And it has done something else. It means that though Starmer, as I said at the beginning, is the absolute heart of this, the Labour government is the quintessence of the blob. Starmer himself is a kind of equivalent of a florist perfume of the blob. You know, he has been distilled with every element, but he can't do anything. It binds him and stops him doing anything as much as it stops doing everybody else.
So, David, this is fascinating, but what has grown up here? What's different? Who's different? What structures are different to those? So I was born in, say, shall I exact? I'm in my late 40s. Well, my very...
I am
very,
double your age.
I'm in my very late 40s.
Okay.
Well, all right, I'm 53, so my very late 40s. But what's happened, what's different to when I was born in 1972? Structurally, what's different? I mean, who was enforcing the rules then? Are there now just more of them? Do they have more power? Were politicians more powerful back in the day, 50 or so years ago, and civil servants loyally followed their orders? Is it civil servants in charge? Is it these quasi-autonomous non-governmental organisations? What's changed over, say, half a century to place more power in some hands and less in others?
Yeah, what I think we've got to do, and you and I now have been doing this so often, we tend to speak in shorthand, and if we do, you must say we're doing it. And in other words, if we go too fast or too slow, please come in. I think that the first thing we've got to recognise, and again, I am very much older than you are with a much longer political memory, but even I did not recognise quite how fundamental the changes that were brought about by Blair's government in 1997 were. What we can do now, retrospectively, and again, this is I'm a historian, and previously I worked on much earlier periods of history, like the Tudor period, but the standard rule of history, I'm afraid, is you only understand things when they have happened. The famous Hegelian phrase of the owl, the grandiose Germanic phrase, the owl of Minerva only flies at dusk. T.S. Eliot, clearer, only in retrospection, selection can you say that was the day. Broadly, what happens under Blair is the following. Roughly from about Magna Carta to 1997, we basically were the world's outstanding example of self-government, of representative self-government, long, long before there was democracy. Democracy is a completely late arrival in this thing, from the late 19th century. Before that, the central institution is the same, it's Parliament. And Parliament binds, and Parliament enforces law upon you for a very simple reason, partly the flamboyance of the Constitution, the golden chamber, the crown in Parliament, the robes, the traditions and whatever. But there's also a much simpler element into it, which was even recognised in the days of the semi-all-powerful medieval monarchy. And it was the idea that everybody is bound by what's decided in Parliament because everybody is there. You're there either in your own person, peer, which you weren't, and maybe never will be.
I'm still holding out hope.
We'll do our best. Or you're there by your representative. And that was the central idea. In other words, it's an idea in which fundamentally those who govern us are sort of answerable to those of us who are governed. And it's an extraordinary idea. It's the basis of every free constitution in the world, which is why this funny Anglo-Norman world, Parliament, is as universal as it is. It's the basis of the American Constitution, which is just a very, very lightly modified, because of course the Americans, I know it's hard to believe, were actually English, and once upon a time, and they took it from us. What Blair did was fundamentally to change that rule. He decided, probably largely following Germany, but the broader European Union, that the idea that government should answer directly to the people was a bad idea because the people were not to be trusted. And instead, and this is where we come now to the crux of the matter, you devolve power in two radically different directions. From people in Parliament, from MPs, Lords in one way or another, are all answerable to the broader electorate. You devolve it in two different directions. On the one hand, you set up a series of expert committees. You used the standard phrase quango, quasi-autonomous non-governmental organisation. And you've got to remind me whether I've remembered correctly, 444
different quangos in the United Kingdom,
which between them control 1/3 of state expenditure, entirely without you having a say over a penny. And they begin at the very top with the creation, at the beginning of that Labour government, that new Labour government in 1997, of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, which takes the most fundamental decision in terms of the management of the economy entirely out of political control.
And then you sort of suggest it caught you off guard. The Blair didn't run on this manifesto, but he brought it in. It was a sort of silent counter-revolution.
Well, it was a silent revolution. I think you can exaggerate the importance of Fukuyama. I think Fukuyama is particularly important in terms of international relations and the so-called RUBIS, the rule-based system of international relations. I think there's something more fundamental. It goes back really to, again, like RUBIS, 1945. Remember, in 1945, there is this tremendous reaction, completely understandable, against what had happened in Nazi Germany. And Nazi Germany, in the analysis, which I think is the influential analysis, is the result of democracy gone wrong, of a sense of nationhood gone wrong. That the emphasis is put on Hitler having won elections, that the German people were complicit in this. So the constitutions that we visit, we play a larger part in the shaping of the West German constitution than any other power, is that you need modified democracy. And what we've finished up with is really standing the idea of democracy on its head. The basic meaning of democracy, again, we were talking about all of these things being Greco-Roman, the basic meaning of democracy is rule of the people. That's simply what it means, and rule by the majority of the people. But what has been decided, and it's the creeping difference between Europe now and America. It's what Farage was talking about, though it has to be said not very eloquently or convincingly, yesterday in DC. It was what J.D. Vance was talking about in a much more constructed and thought through fashion in that Munich conference, when he reduced the poor German chairman to tears. I mean, dear me. It is the idea that proper democracy, liberal democracy, is about limiting the majority and protecting minorities. And you do that by removing power as far as possible from the directly elected and giving it to these break groups, the expert on the one hand and the lawyer on the other.
So let's come on to the lawyer thing.
I think in other words, what Blair was doing was very much part of it was seen as the final moment in which us, Britain, England, which it really is, was the grit in the oyster of the European Union. The European Union is the ultimate form of this rule of experts, the rule of regulation. We were the grit in the oyster. Blair's purpose was to make sure that we were smothered in European Roman law, Napoleonic style, mother of pearl.
This is so fascinating because what I want to tease out here was that, and I think you would confess yourself, David, that wasn't recognised at the time. I mean, one of the fascinating, I can remember sitting around a table after for dinner with a number of MPs in the immediate aftermath of the 2019 election, where the Conservatives won in a landslide, and sitting around the table there were 4 or 5 new Tory MPs, and I won't name him because it was a private discussion, but an old guard Tory MP who'd been around the block forever and a day, and actually a Labour MP as well. And one of the young Tory MPs, one of the freshman Tory MPs, asked him, so looking back over your 30 years, he came in just after Thatcher, of parliamentary life, who is your favourite right-wing Prime Minister? To which his reply was, Tony Blair. And the feeling at the time, wasn't it, was that, if you like, certainly on economics, the right had won. That actually Labour could win in a landslide and you didn't need to sort of panic or flee the country or shut down your business. That Blair ascended to the throne in the same sort of way as Bill Clinton in the United States, that suddenly the left were safe. They got market economics. They weren't going to bow down to their union paymasters. They weren't going to nationalise the commanding heights of the economy. Capitalism had won. That was my feeling of it when I didn't vote for the Labour Party in that election, but I kind of felt it didn't much matter. That our side had been so successful that the other side have accepted our underpinning principles. But what you're saying is, whilst accepting the basic capitalist hypothesis, they did something under the table.
Infinitely more radical. And of course, it's not just us, it's not just you, it's not just me. It is the sainted Margaret herself. Margaret Thatcher, in 2002, says that Blair is the ultimate trophy of her triumph.
Oh, she was asked, wasn't she?
She was asked.
Sum up your greatest success in 2
your
words.
greatest
She said
success
Tony
is
Blair.
Tony Blair. Now, I think before we go on and talk about law, because it's very important, we now need to recognise that we are dealing with something that we've been here before. That's to say, we are now manifestly, and here I'm going to show, I hope, a little broader historical perspective than I was doing in the 1990s. We are now manifestly rerunning the 1970s. It is clear to everybody, I think, that that's what we're doing. We're going, and Mark and I have discussed this endlessly, we are facing a massive fiscal crisis, which may or may not result in the equivalent of 1976, when the IMF were called in with Dennis Healey, having a set of policies very, very similar to those of Rachel Reeves. 1979, of course, the winter of discontent. Well, if you live in Birmingham, and we are very near Birmingham, you've already got it. You've already got the rot, the rats, the trade unionists, the whole caboodle. But there's something more important. Why had the Conservative Party in the 1970s got itself into exactly the same mess that the Conservative Party did in 2010? This is the real issue, because those of you who are a little bit informed on this, and I'm sure many people in this room are, you will know that there was an extraordinary turnaround in the Conservative Party in the middle of the 1970s, which is represented by the election of Margaret Thatcher and the emergence of her guru, Keith Joseph. Joseph, after the shattering defeat, not on the scale of the defeat we've just experienced now, but nevertheless the absolutely fundamental one, when in 2 elections Heath went to the country saying, who governs the country? And I remember, ladies and gentlemen, I voted Liberal. The answer came back, anybody but you, if you remember. Now, what happened? What was Keith Joseph saying? And you again, the IEA, your institution was extraordinarily involved in this. There was the then spawned institution of the Institute of Policy Studies and whatever, the thing that Joseph himself creates. What Joseph says after those defeats is, I have had a Damascene conversion. I realise that although I said I was conservative, I wasn't. And although I've been a member of conservative governments, exactly as you said in your introduction, they'd done nothing that was conservative. And this, I think, ladies and gentlemen, and again, we're in France, we need to understand history. Conservatism, from its very beginning, has been intellectually insecure. Because we were founded, right, okay, we're very near where we were founded. Anybody remember who founds the Conservative Party, when and in which place?
Oh. Tamworth.
Tamworth, round the
Peel.
corner. Round the corner, 1835, in the wake of the Great Reform Act, and by Sir Robert Peel. And what Peel says in that manifesto is, we accept the change. We accept the 1832
The
Reform
extension
Act.
of the franchise.
The vast extent, but it was the fundamental restructuring of our politics is what it amounts to. And he says, we accept that. On the other hand, we'll take a measured view on other changes. And it is that uneasy relationship. Continental conservative parties, well, they're not, they're something much more radical. They simply tend to say, we don't want anything. We've been much more rational. Disraeli puts it brilliantly, we're a progressive country. Change happens. The question is what sort of change? And the problem is the Conservative Party has never been very good at answering that question. The result is it took us from 1835 until the 1870s before the Conservative Party again becomes the natural party of government. After the extraordinary changes of 1945 to 51, what does the Conservative Party do? What does Churchill do? He goes along with a fundamentally neo-communist economy, one that had been erected. You know, the creation of the NHS, of an unfunded welfare state, on the back of a broken, bankrupt wartime economy was deranged. Of course it was deranged. It's why our economic growth post the Second World War is so much worse than that of the European countries. We took the wrong decision. And the people who took the worst wrong decision was us. And so in 51, the Conservative Party does exactly what you described in 2010. It decides to go along with what had gone before. And indeed, nowadays we use the term uniparty. It's very, I mean, ladies and gentlemen, I find it very uncomfortable being sophisticate and academic, Oxbridge and all the rest of it, using the terms of internet abuse, like the uniparty. But you know, they're true. There really was a uniparty. Do you know what? There was a uniparty after 1951. There are some people here almost as ancient as I am. You will remember it was called Boscalism. It was that middle ground, alleged middle ground, neo-Keynesian economics, prices and incomes policies, the whole lot. And it was that that Thatcher and particularly Keith Joseph decided they had to break with. In the middle of the 1970s. What we're in the position now is, retrospectively, in this retrospection selection, we can see that Cameron and Osborne and May and all the rest of it made exactly the same mistake in 2010. They went along with the Blairite state. Cameron even advertises the fact. He says, I am the heir to Blair. He says, I want a Conservative Party where Liberals feel welcome. They positively embrace the fact that they didn't have a majority in 2010 and they had to be in a coalition with the Liberals. The worst of the lot, of course, is the appalling Theresa May. If we're ever to recover, we have got to take the whip away from Theresa May. Theresa May is the one who stands on the steps of Downing Street and says, I want to talk about burning injustices. What on earth is a Conservative Party Prime Minister doing, talking about burning injustices? What on earth is a Conservative leader doing, describing the party as a nasty party? What on earth is a Conservative Prime Minister doing, legislating net zero? What on earth is a Conservative Party Prime Minister doing, allowing people like Maria Miller to begin the processes of gender self-recognition? And I could continue. This absolute catastrophe.
So I want to press you. Let me put the counter case here. Let me play.
There isn't one.
Well,
yes.
Let me play devil's advocate. Let me play devil's advocate at least tactically. Tactically. So you asked a quiz question to the room. Up to and including John Major, only one leader of the Conservative Party had failed to become Prime Minister. Can anybody name that man? No, up to John Major. Up to and including John Major. So from Robert Peel to John Major, if you were leader of the Conservative Party, it was basically a nailed-on ticket that you would be Prime Minister at some point, with only one exception. That was Austin Chamberlain. Every other person who was leader of the Tory party, from Robert Peel to John Major, was Prime Minister at some point. Ted Heath lost elections, but he was Prime Minister. Then after John Major, we add to the Austin Chamberlain losers gallery by adding on William Hague, Ian Duncan Smith,
Michael Howard.
So suddenly we've quadrupled in very, very quickly, in just a decade, the number of leaders of the Conservative Party who don't become Prime Minister. The Cameroons would come back and say, this was an adaptation we had to make. We didn't just lose 1997, we got slaughtered by the same margin in 2001. By 2005, when the love affair with Blair was over and the Iraq War and all of that, we still got pretty hammered, with Michael Howard cutting the majority somewhat, but a clear victory for Blair. We had to adapt to the consensus, and lo and behold, when we did, 5 years later, we're back in office and get 14 years of an unbeaten stretch. Had we gone down the Starkey route, we would have added more leaders to the losers lists of Haig, IDS and Howard. We would have had many, many more. We did the adaptation that Robert Peel and Disraeli made in order to make the Conservative Party relevant again and get it back into office. What is your riposte to that?
The riposte is very simple. You're in government, but you're not in power. And you can't actually do anything that matters. Mm-hmm. And the result, I'm a great believer in judging by results. I am not a Christian, but I do think Jesus, I think he was pretty terrible at theology. He was absolutely brilliant at politics. He's got this wonderful line, by their fruits ye shall know them. Judge by results. And the result of the Cameroon, the Osborne, the May policy is where we are now, which, ladies and gentlemen, to put it in the technical language of political analysis, is we're fucked. That is what happens when you go down that route. And exactly the same way as the Conservative Party was in the middle of the 1970s, exactly as the Conservative Party became in the middle of the 19th century. And it's not until you do the fundamental exercise of thinking, questioning and deciding, which I am proposing we do now, that you escape from that kind of catastrophe.
Fascinating. Now, ladies and gents, well, I hope you're not sick of our voices yet. I've got a few more questions I want to ask David over about the next, say, 10 minutes. Then I'm going to go over to you guys, and you can ask us anything you want at all. I'll give you a hint. If it's a question about football, direct it to me, not to David. But so preferably broadly along the contents of what we've said. But we'll try and answer any question at all. But David, I want to get back to your broader analysis, which I've wholly bought into, about what's gone wrong in Britain and that the Conservative Party still hasn't addressed, and perhaps conservatism as a whole hasn't addressed. And we've done a lot on the quangos, that vast amounts of power have been shifted from elected politicians who now can't comment on operational matters, right? So, an Irish comedian is arrested by 5 armed police officers getting off a plane from Arizona. You would have thought he was the leader of Al Qaeda or something, because he said some slightly untoward, moderately unfunny things on Twitter. 5 armed police officers. Now, Sir Keir Starmer's official spokesman, raised an eyebrow and sneered at this and said, well, those aren't the priorities of the government, but we can't comment on operational matters. This is an oddity for me, because let's imagine, just as a thought experiment, I'm not suggesting this is actually occurring, that some constabulary somewhere, some regional police force, said that operationally, in our county, we're now going to only focus on litter dropping as a crime. And if we find you dropping a piece of litter, expect several armed police officers to surround you and cart you off to prison. We're not going to be responding to any complaints about rape, armed robbery, murder, arson, GBH or the rest of it. We're just going to go for the litter droppers. Would the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom say, well, that's an operational matter for the local police? Or would he say, this is absolutely crazy, the Home Secretary is going to fire whoever is in charge of this police department? Now, that's about policing, but that links in to our criminal justice system and our justice system more widely. And your analysis, explain a little about this, is that judges and the law, and perhaps even the police, have become enormously more empowered, a bit like the quangos. On the one hand, we've given a whole load of power away to the experts. But on the other hand, we've given a whole load of political power away to the legal system and the judicial system. What happened there and why does it matter?
Transformed it into, with no consultation, with no parliamentary backing, into something completely different. He added three fundamental principles to the rule of law. By the way, he decided there were 8 principles for the rule of law. When 7 were good enough for God, I've no idea why 8 were necessary for Tom Bingham, but never mind, he obviously put himself above God as well as above Parliament. But the three key ones, and they will be things that will resonate with you very clearly, because they touch everything that's been going on, the whole business of the small boats, the whole business of Ruda Kabane, the whole business of Kalokane. What he said were 3 things. That the principle of equality before the law means that the same law applies to everybody. In other words, the newly landed illegal immigrant has exactly the same protections as you and me, and is entitled to exactly the same welfare provisions as you and me. Secondly, he says, naturally in common law, human rights law is incorporated, which is why, even if we try to get rid of the bloody ECHR, our judges will still try to say this stuff is there. And then the third thing was, he said international law is incorporated, which is why we gave away the Chagos Islands. And do you know who wrote Bingham's major obituary in The Guardian, the longest obituary which The Guardian, that well-known paper of left-wing record, has actually published? Philippe Sands, who is the man who acted on behalf of Mauritius against the British government and said his greatest moment of pride was when he saw the Union Jack being torn down, and who gives the Bingham lecture last year? Lord Hermer, our Attorney General. And so what you've done is you've turned law against the nation.
But David, give me, again, you were so good on the quangos, give me some examples of what lawyers or judges are deciding now that would have been out with their competence when I were a young lad.
Well,
what sort of things are happening that they're determining and they've got the power to determine now and they didn't used to?
The extraordinary things is, if you look, 2 things. You look at we'll look at big and small. If you actually look at what Bingham says about the purpose of human rights, he says the essential purpose of human rights is anti-democratic. He actually says it. It's there to protect minorities against the majority. And he lists the minorities: the mad, the insane, Ruda Kabana, Kalokane. They should have been in secure mental hospitals from the age of 13. The Roma, those extraordinary performances in Leeds. Immigrants of weird religious backgrounds, the whole of the Muslim rape, the Pakistani rape cases. All of that is, in other words, this notion of 2-tier law is actually now written into the law.
So if you're a white, straight Christian man,
you're
going to be discriminated against.
I mean, it is actually, this is what is so shocking, what even people like Robert Jenrick have not fully understood. This is actually now written into law, and moreover, every KC has to subscribe to this before he can be promoted. You have to go through a DEI training. It's now absolutely, fundamentally entrenched. But the most scandalous case, of course, was the ruling by the Supreme Court that Boris's prorogation of Parliament was illegal. This completely defies our Constitution as it developed from 1689 onwards. With that famous clause in the Bill of Rights that proceedings in Parliament are not subject to scrutiny by any other court. We've now got ourselves to a position in which the Supreme Court is within a whisker, and indeed in 2 cases it's come within more than a whisker, of actually ruling that the rule of law is more important than the sovereignty of Parliament. And until we as a party grasp what's happening, in other words, we are now seeing the entire tradition of the English Constitution. And again, we used to be, ladies and gentlemen, These are going to be very funny, old-fashioned words. If you'd listened to Disraeli, if you'd listened to Peel, if you'd listened even to Baldwin, listened to Salisbury, they would have said that the Conservative Party is fundamentally the party of the Constitution. It's the party that believes, because the Constitution is how we've governed ourselves. It's a kind of brief abstract of our history. We've forgotten this, and the machinery has turned against us. And until we recover that sense and understanding, we're lost.
David, I want to come over to the audience, but just to warm you up, get all of your questions. Just finish with this then, because that was a rallying cry to the Conservative Party. But if, in whatever guise, people of some colour of blue rosette or other form the next government, and I should just say that when we leave here, David and I are going behind enemy lines to the Reform UK conference in Birmingham. We're always very decent. We always say we're Conservatives, but we come in peace, and we haven't been shot dead yet. That if a government of broadly this intention, whether it's the Conservative Party, the Reform Party, some amalgamation of the two, some coalition between the two, what's it need to do in 2029 on sort of day one, day 100 to put things right? It might be quite easy to be elected because this government is so appalling. In fact, it was quite easy for Keir Starmer's Labour Party to be elected because the outgoing Conservative government was so appalling. So let's almost take as given that a right-wing government comes in 2029. What's it need to do fast to get us back on track, rather than just celebrate its own victory and blame the previous guys for the mess we're in?
What it needs to do is what I've labelled the Great Repeal and Restoration. That's to say, that entire structure that was that misbegotten structure that's created by Blair and Brown has to be demolished, piecemeal and in its entirety. You can't do it bit by bit. The whole lot has got to go. Now, this will be the most extraordinary enterprise. It will be the biggest single change in how we are governed since 1832 or even 1689. It's got to be a government which is profoundly prepared. In other words, it's got to be the contrast between Trump 1 and Trump 2. If you remember Trump 2, when he enters after that very brief swearing-in ceremony in the rotunda of the Capitol, he goes straight to the resolute 1850 desk in the Oval Office, and his evil genius, Stephen Miller, is standing behind him with this great pile of executive orders, and they're signed. And we don't have executive orders, but we need to have a similar state of preparation and organisation. Because, of course, the thing that is the classic revelation of what happens when you don't is this government. Starmer thought he could just waltz into Downing Street and twiddle a few dials and everything would be fine. And instead you see this drifting catastrophe. But it means there's got to be profound preparation, profound thought, a careful choice of personnel, an absolute understanding of legal process. And without wanting to let too many cats out of the bag, there is now a group well funded by the Prosperity Institute, well named, in Charles Street in Mayfair, who is working on this. The great issue is going to be, will there be, from Farage or whoever will lead that new government in 29, will there be the fundamental intellectual and moral and political commitment? Because it will be a task which the entire machinery of the Blairite state will fight against to the last man and the last woman and the last transgendered person. They really will. It will be an extraordinarily difficult task.
But that's the challenge. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed listening to David and his thoughts as much as I have. I have no doubt this is I have no doubt this is the necessary blueprint for the next British government. I very much hope it becomes the blueprint of the Conservative Party.